Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Quattrone, and I want to welcome you to the Scotia Festival. Thank you for coming out to hear me talk about stories about people who have fed South Jersey over the years and people like myself who are working to rebuild the food system. Let's get started. Okay. So I have a project called Library Seed Bank, and what I do is I brought the concept of seed libraries to the South Jersey area in 2014, and if you're not familiar with it, a seed library is a collection of open pollinated or heirloom seeds that are available to the public to be checked out like traditional library media. It's requested that seeds are returned back to the library, and when this happens, it becomes a self-sustaining project. What we find as seed librarians is people in suburban areas tend not to return seeds, people in urban areas, and in rural areas do. So essentially, a lot of these seed libraries become distribution for seeds, but it opens up the opportunity to talk to people about the necessity of saving seeds and the state of where we're at with the consolidation in the seed industry and how 3 agrochemical companies own up to 70% of the seed lines. I'm also an artist, and I have a propaganda series. It's called Growing the Food Sovereignty Revolution, and it's a tribute to the Victory Garden series from World War I and World War II. The government was encouraging people to secure their own food to support the war effort, and with people like myself and other folks who are working to, as I mentioned, rebuild the food system, it seemed like an appropriate type of project to express about. So I'm also an artist. I'm a Stockton graduate. I graduated in 1984 as an art major, and I'm back working with Scotia doing environmental work. I'm also working with Ron Hutchinson. As you can see, there's a possible Arc of Taste seed library coming here at Stockton. I work with an organization called Slow Food. Slow Food, we're an international organization that supports good, clean, fair food. Good food is food that tastes good and is nutritionally dense. Fair food is food that is produced with respect to everything and everybody in the process. And clean food is food that is not genetically modified or heavily processed. What we really do is we help to preserve local foods and local food traditions. And the Arc of Taste is a catalog of food that is threatened, endangered, or at risk of extinction. So we go into the community, we find these foods, we document them, and then we use the Arc as an educational tool to link chefs and farmers and the public so people can taste their history, and hopefully products are made and people buy the products, or chefs have it in the restaurants, the seeds get refreshed every year, the farmer makes some money. So it's a good way to promote preserving food biodiversity. I'm hosting the first seed swap for Slow Food USA at Slow Nations. Slow Nations is our annual festival. It's in Denver the weekend of July 19th this year. And I'm also leading the effort for a Slow Seed Alliance, and that's tied into the possible Arc of Taste seed library here at Stockton. One of the concerns that Ron Hutchinson had when he offered us cold storage for seeds was that he may not be able to grow the seeds out to keep them fresh. So as a response to feedback that we got at Slow Nations last year, we're looking to put together an alliance of seed farmers. So with this alliance of seed farmers, and we have the cold storage here at Stockton, it offers a great opportunity to create an Arc of Taste seed library, which will be the first one in the United States. I'm also a member of Slow Food International Seed Working Group, and I was a sponsored delegate to Slow Food International's 2018 Terra Madre conference last year, where I helped with the programming. And I'll be a speaker at the National Heirloom Festival this year in September, and that's really a big three-day seed swap, so that's a great opportunity to pull together this Seed Farmers Alliance. So that's the background that I have. Okay, so when I started this project, my goal was to try to learn from people who had built the food system so that we would have kind of a roadmap and some guidance for people like myself that are trying to rebuild it. And the more I listened to the stories that these farmers or people who were involved in supplying their own food, the more I heard them talking in indirect terms about food sovereignty. And food sovereignty is basically the right to secure your own food. In 2007, it was the first global forum on food sovereignty in Malawi. And this definition that you see on the screen on your left-hand side is just part of it. And as you see, it's the rights of people to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods. And it's the right to define their food and their agricultural system. So basically, what happened was, with globalization in the 90s, there was a lot of consolidation in the food industry. There was a lot of consolidation in the agricultural chemical industry. And when this was happening, it was taking away the rights of small farmers. So there were some pushbacks against this, and this pushback ended up being called food sovereignty. This organization, La Via Campesina, is the international peasants movement, and they originated the term in 1913. And as you'll see, it's small-scale farmers organized as a response to the globalization of agricultural policies and agribusinesses. And they came up with their three struggles, or their struggles, which there are three of them: defending food sovereignty, the struggle for land and agrarian reforms, promoting agroecology, and defending local seeds, and promoting peasants' rights and struggle against criminalizations of peasants. So then there was the Forum for Food Sovereignty in Malawi in 2007. In April of 2018, the UN and the World Bank came up with their definition, which again is defining the rights of people and sovereign states to democratically determine their own agricultural and food policies. In September 2008, Ecuador included food sovereignty in its constitution. In 2010, the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance was formed, and in 2011, 400 people from 34 European countries met to start a food sovereignty movement there. So it's a relatively new concept as far as global organization goes, but it's a big response to the situation that we're facing with food choices these days. These are the Schollenbergs, and what was interesting, they were the first interview that I listened to. Dave Burdock's students were the folks that were going out and doing most of these interviews, and when I listened to Al talk about how he secured food for his family, Al was not a farmer, but him and May had 11 acres and 7 children, and they grew their own food. They had goats and they had chickens, but they didn't have cows, so they had some dairy with goat milk. And just listening to Al talk about, his experience with growing his own food, and he saw the direction that we're going within food choices today, this really started to move the direction of the project towards looking at how food sovereignty existed in the early 1900s through the 1950s, and people didn't realize that they had it because it wasn't needed because we had such a strong local food system. So it was an interesting outcome from the interviews. Stories have a way of telling themselves if you get out of your way sometimes to listen to them. And the story was starting to tell me that we should look at this through the lens of food sovereignty in addition to the history of farming. Al is also the president of the Atlantic County Grange. The Grange is a farmers movement that started right after the Civil War, and it was an organizing effort for lobbying the government for farmers' rights. And one of the key things that they were instrumental in lobbying the government for was rural free mail delivery. The Grange has become more of a public type of a program these days because of lack of local farming interests in what they do. But Al's a great guy, and listening to him talk, he really got the whole idea about securing your own food. Salem County. I live in Salem County now, and Salem County is a large agricultural county here in the state of New Jersey, and our county seat, Salem City, is a food desert, which is kind of an interesting juxtaposition when you look at all the fresh food that's being grown outside of the county seat, but there's no access for low-income folks to fresh vegetables within Salem City. So the rights of the people in the city to secure their own food is really limited by a number of reasons, a lot of it being economics, and just that there's not a structure in place these days for local food systems to bring food from where it's being grown 10 miles away into the town where it's needed. They did attempt to have a farmer's market there, but it wasn't successful. Farmers markets are a big challenge. To have a farmer to take a whole day or a day and a half to pick their crops and clean their crops and secure them for markets, and to take them into a city, if they're not going to make the money that they need to pay their laborers to continue working their farm, they're not going to be interested in participating in a farmer's market. One of the interesting things in Salem County is they have a tradition there of eating muskrat, and it's a really cool. I think it's great. The people who trap the muskrats, they trap them in the wintertime and they sell the pelts and they sell the meat. And in the summertime, they also are crabbers. So they're working the tributaries and what's available for living off the land there. And they used to have this muskrat dinner every year. It was a fundraiser for the Lower Alloway Township Fire Department, and last year was the first year they didn't do it. It was going to be the 80th year that this tradition was going on. And people who have lived in Salem County or had been to this dinner would come back for it. So this dinner was very popular. It was just difficult for the folks in the fire company that were running it to find the volunteers to pull it off. So last year was the first time in 80 years that this tradition didn't continue. And I have questions out to a native of Salem County who eats muskrat, is familiar with the tradition. So I'm waiting to get those answers back. So he's going to ask his peers to give us more in-depth description about this tradition that goes on there. There are pockets of communities in the country that do have these muskrat dinners. Salem County is the only one in New Jersey. There's one in central Delaware. There's a couple on the eastern shore of Maryland. And there's also, outside of St. Louis, there is a community there that does it. And in St. Louis, the community there got an exemption from the Catholic Church to eat muskrat during Lent because it's an aquatic animal, which I think is another interesting little tradition there. So it's one of the questions I have out to my friend in Salem County who wants to be very discreet about this. That's why I'm not mentioning his name. I want to see if that tradition with the Catholic Church has been extended here in South Jersey, which would be kind of cool that it did. What you see here is, this is one of the posters for my propaganda series, and it's for the Earliana tomato. And the Earliana tomato has, it's a significant tomato in the history of food in South Jersey. What happened was, in the late 1890s, there was a gentleman by the name of George Sparks, and he had a sport in his garden, and a sport is a naturally occurring genetic mutation on a plant. And the sport was a tomato that was ripening a couple weeks ahead of the earliest ripening tomato at that time. So he took the tomato and he saved the seeds, and he started working with the Johnson Stokes Seed Company, which was a seed company that was in the Morristown, Vincenttown area in Burlington County here in South Jersey. And because this tomato was so early and so prolific, it became a choice of farmers to grow to get to market earlier. And this black and white photograph that you see, the caption on it is shipping Earliana tomatoes in Swedesboro, New Jersey. So if you think about the ultimate Jersey tomato, you know, nature created this by a genetic mutation. So it's really kind of cool. And it drove the canning industry for a number of years in the early 1900s. Okay, Burt Norris. If you're not familiar with Burt Norris is an area that's in the Bayshore area. It's where the oyster industry was centered up until the virus that ended the oyster industry in the 50s. But it was this thriving community along the bay. And this is Dominic Capaldi, and he's a very interesting man. He was the longest interview that we had. We have a recording for him of close to 3 hours. His grandfather was a stonemason in Pittsburgh, and his grandfather decided that he didn't like Pittsburgh and he didn't like being a stonemason, so he was going to come to South Jersey and buy a farm. And he went to the train station, and when he was at the train station, he was talking to someone at the train station, and they asked him where he was going, and he said he was going to Vineland, New Jersey to buy a farm. And this person responded to them like saying, the land in Vineland is so expensive, come to Burt Norris. So his grandfather came to Burt Norris, and he bought a farm. There was a settlement of Italian immigrants, so he felt comfortable with the people that he was farming with. And Dominic was the third generation, and unfortunately, he had to sell his farm because his children didn't want any part of it. So he was the third generation. His family farmed in Burt Norris for 106 years. He really has a deep appreciation of the area and the culture and what was going on, you know, while the oyster business was thriving. And the other interesting thing that he pointed out was the oyster business was opposite of the farming business. So the folks that worked in the shucking shacks, when their work was done with the oyster industry, it was just about time for them to work on the farms. So they had, the folks that did this labor had year-round employment, which added to a stable economy there. And you had the business of farming, you had the business of oysters, and it was a thriving area. If you go to Burt Norris today and you look at it, it's really a shame to see that there's no economic activity here, knowing what it once was. So Dominic had, he was in the oyster business, but what ended up happening was after the oyster business went away and the help left, they had to move to mechanical harvesting because they couldn't get enough help to harvest the vegetables. They became grain farmers, and they set up a machine shop on their farm, and they found themselves a really interesting niche. When you, like, in a casket, they have a crank which raises the body up for viewing, and there was a certain piece that they made at their machine shop for these caskets. So the part that they produced was always in need because you could never buy it used because the caskets were buried. So they found themselves a pretty cool niche. And farmers, they're business people, and they have to diversify because they're relying on weather. There are, pests. There's a lot of challenges with farming, and that was the niche that they found. So he was a very interesting guy. He didn't want his farming legacy to end on his watch, but he didn't have a choice about that because his children told him to sell the farm and enjoy the benefit of that. So he's a great guy. I wish I had a chance to meet him, but he's in Florida now. So another interesting thing that came out of this was policy and community. When this started, there was no intention on my part to talk about public policy or people who were administering it. But as I mentioned, stories have a way of telling themselves, and this was presented to us. We had the opportunity to talk to Art Brown, who created policy and legislation, Goldie Waldrick, who was a community organizer who implemented public policy, and Sharon Kessler Dempsey, who her family's farm was acquired via public policy. So this random coming together of these three pieces was fortunate because, when you're talking about, if you're looking this through the right to secure food, public policy involves rights too. And Art Brown, if you don't know who Art Brown is, he's very significant in the history of agriculture in New Jersey. He served as the agricultural secretary from 1982 to 2001. So for 19 years, he was the agricultural secretary. He's the second longest serving agricultural secretary in New Jersey. Philip Lampe is the longest serving one, who happens to be my cousin, which was a really cool connection because when I met Art and I had the fortunate opportunity to interview him, I got to meet someone who knew my cousin, who I never met. But what Art did as agriculture secretary, he's responsible for the Jersey Fresh program, which served as a model for other states to raise the awareness and marketing their farmers' goods. He also was responsible for Farmland Preservation, which allowed public money to be used to secure that farmland would be preserved for the future. And what Art told me was his intention on doing this was to have the public land or the farming land be affordable for farmers who are just starting out. Because one of the things that happens in New Jersey over the course of the years, in the late 1890s or late 1800s into probably about until to the 1940s, we had lots of 10 to 15 to 20 acre farms. And for someone who's starting out, that's a manageable piece of land to work. But what happened was, as those farmers decided to retire, they sold their farms and they got bought up by neighboring farms. And before you knew it, you had 3 20-acre farms, which got bought by the guy that already had 60 acres. Now we have one guy who owns 120 acres, and having that piece of land, if he was going to try to sell 120 acres, if you're a farmer that is just starting out, to get financing for that was really difficult. So the intention of the Farmland Preservation was to preserve these tracts of lands for future farmers. And he also worked with the legislator on New Jersey's Right to Farm Act, which gave farmers more rights over their properties for certain environmental things and noise ordinances that local municipalities might try to impose on farmers when the transition was happening from farmland to suburbs. So, people are moving to the suburbs. They want to live in, in a farming community, but then they don't want to hear tractors and they don't want to deal with, cow manure smells and things like that. So by working with the legislators on the Right to Farm Act, he was able to protect farmers. He's a really great guy. It was a real honor to meet him and to interview him. Okay, Goldie. Goldie is one of the most dynamic people I ever met in my life. Here we are at a farm doing a run, as they call it. And Goldie, what she did was she was gleaning farms, and gleaning is going to a farm and cleaning out produce that is left over from the harvest, and then taking that and using that to provide food for people who needed it. And she was doing this in the late 70s and early 80s. And she was dealing with food waste, and which is a current issue, which is getting a lot of attention. And she's just, she's priceless. The first day I went to meet her, I sat there with my jaw dropped for 3.5 hours listening to how dynamic and the life that she led, and she's just so full of energy. And when she was telling me about, the gleaning and how she saw, the food waste was such an issue, I said to her, you can be teaching the people today. And she's like, that's what I think. And she's just a wonderful person. And I can't say enough good things about her. She has a thrift shop in Bridgeton, New Jersey, and she gets stuff donated to her. And what she sells, she uses that money to buy food to distribute to people who need it. And the day that we went on this run, we're going to get her story to be stored here at Stockton Archives. So once I worked out the details on that, I went down to talk to her and her daughter Judy, who is her caretaker, but who doesn't live in the area. So when I got there, and they were like, "You want to go out on this run with us?" Because they got a call from the farmer that they were harvesting that day. So we went to the Sparacino Farms, and the gentleman in the white T-shirt is Charlie Sparacino. It was his farm, and his parents and Goldie's husband used to be friends, and they used to quote-unquote party together. So there was this intergenerational relationship between Goldie and Charlie, which was priceless. And the gentleman that's facing Charlie, the tall guy in the blue T-shirt, that's his nephew, who is now taking over the farm. So it's good to see that this farm is continuing within the family. But seeing the bins of produce that were being rejected for going to market was stunning. I know that this happens, but this was the first time I seen it. So we pulled about 100 pounds of produce out of these bins, put them in the truck, and we were driving to drop these off at the thrift shop in Bridgeton. And we decided to stop off in one of Charlie's fields to pick up some squash blossoms. Squash blossoms are this delicacy, and it's a tradition that Goldie or her daughter cooks them for Charlie. Charlie has the farm. It's just there were so many traditions involved here, and watching this was just a beautiful thing. So we stopped off in this field, and I'm out there picking these, large bag of flowers because I know lots of people who like these squash blossoms. And it started to rain. The horn beeps on the truck. And I went over, and now Goldie's driving. So when we drove into the farm, Judy was driving her daughter, and now Goldie's going to drive on the way back to Bridgeton. As we're driving out, the truck starts fishtailing. And Goldie's behind the wheel, and she's got this. Obviously, she's been through this before. And she was more concerned about having to call Charlie to pull her out of a ditch with his tractor than she was about fishtailing. So we got back on the road, and we got to Bridgeton, and then we dropped the food off, and then we went for ice cream. She's a real treasure, and she's done a lot of good for a lot of people. And She has receipts. She's documented everything that she's done. She had boxes and boxes and boxes of these documentations, which for someone who's into preservation like myself, it's just this gold mine of information. So it was interesting, even though she didn't implement any of the policies that Art created, she still implemented public policy. And then Sharon Kessler Dempsey, her family's farm was acquired by public policy. Sharon's grandparents came from Long Island, and they had a truck farm in Monmouth County. And a truck farm is a farm that loads up trucks that takes produce and goes to sell at market. And one of their clients was Horn and Harditz, which I think is pretty cool because the Horn and Harditz with their, I can't think of the name of it, but you put the quarter in and then you get your food. It was really kind of a very innovative technology at the time. And what happened was they had 400 acres, and the state needed a portion of it because the Manasquan River passed behind the farm, and they needed some of the acreage around this river for a reservoir. So they ended up acquiring all 400 acres of this farm, but they did it through the Green Acres Act, which is for open space and public recreation. And the interesting thing is the money for Green Acres and the money for Farmland Preservation both come out of the same trust fund. And so I just thought that having this opportunity to look at, people who created the policy, who implemented the policy, and who had, was part of public policy being implemented, added another depth of interest to this story. Okay. All right, so we're about down to 4 minutes. So we're just going to, this was another great story. This is Joe Adams. Joe was, when we started doing this, Dave put out a call to his Scotia mailing list, and Joe responded that he wanted to participate in it. And Joe was, he was a third-generation farmer. He was 90 years old, and we interviewed him in March of last year. And he shared a lot of great stories about his family, and he also talked a lot about farming. He was a grain farmer. He grew soybean, wheat, and corn. So he provided a typed up history of his family, which even though he was interviewed in March of last year, I just got this in April of this year. So I scanned it and I sent an email off to Dave and to Ron Hutchinson, who's an associate professor of biology here. Because Ron he's into farming and he's into history, and he lives in Northfield, and Joe is from Northfield. So I thought, hey, Ron, here's some local information for you. So Ron shared it with one of his students who he knew was from Northfield, and he asked Riley if Riley knew Joe or if was a friend of his family. As it turns out, Riley was the great-grandson of Joe. And Riley is becoming a farmer himself. He's studying here at Stockton. So I had the opportunity to interview Riley as well. So essentially we have 6 generations of this family and their history, which again, when you start a process, you never know what's going to happen. And that's the beauty of it. So to have this gift of 6 generations for us in this storytelling project is truly remarkable in my mind. So let's see, we're at 11:28 now. So I'm just going to wrap this up. I think this has been it's been a real lesson for me. Starting out with one direction and ending up going in another. But the interesting thing was, because I am so concerned about the right to secure food, and I see where we're at with a lot of this stuff. I don't know if it's just because I'm attuned to it, but listening to these folks tell their stories, they got it, and they saw what they had, and they saw where we're going today. So it was a very good lesson for me, and I hope that as this project continues, it'll be a lesson for everyone else. Thank you. Anybody have any questions real quick? We have probably about a minute. Yes. Oh, okay. Well, what she does is she has in her thrift shop in Bridgeton, she has a refrigerator and a freezer, and she stores the food in the refrigerator. And she works with the Salvation Army. And through the Salvation Army, they distribute food through there. And then in years past, I'm not sure that they do this before, she just puts an open call out and lets people know, I have food, it's available, just stop by. She doesn't do any means testing. If someone's hungry and they need food, they just have to go in and they get food. And she wants to do it with dignity, and she wants to do it with honor. And I think that that's a really beautiful thing. So she knows the farmers in the area, specifically Charlie is where she gets a lot of Charlie Sparacino, who we ended up interviewing for this project as well. So that's what she does. It's very low tech, and it's a beautiful thing, I think. Because to me, being a second generation Italian, food was always, going to my grandmother's house. I don't ever remember my grandmother not being at the kitchen table. And even in my immediate family, we'd have family meetings, and it would be at the kitchen table. Everything was about food. It was come in, sit down, have some coffee, have something to eat. And when you're sharing food with people, it becomes a very intimate experience because a lot of your walls are down, and it's a really great way to bond. And to think about people not having access to food to have that experience, or just going hungry. To someone like myself, it's just very disturbing. Yes. Well, there's a New Jersey Farmers Against Hunger, and they're a nonprofit, and they're connected to Rutgers University, and they do a lot of gleaning, and they're fortunate because they connect with a lot of corporations who have those community days. So they do a lot of that, and then what happens with them is they have a network of food pantries that when they go into an area and they glean a farm, they supply the food to this network of people. You're welcome. Anyone else? Yes. Oh, okay. Okay, so the muskrat. Okay, so the muskrat is, people in Salem County are very proud about living off the land. And, eating muskrat there is part of their culture. And they would have this big dinner every year at the Lower Alloways Fire Department. And it was a fundraiser for the fire department. So this dinner grew so into such a big event because the people who had experienced it moved away, and they would sell tickets, and more people would want to get involved. And the fire company had trouble recruiting volunteers last year to prepare the muskrat because it's a process, from what I understand. They have to skin it, they have to let it soak for a couple days. There's a lot of work involved with it. So last year was the first year in 80 years that they didn't do that. But it goes beyond just the muskrat. It's the cultural thing of the people who trap and who also crab in the summertime. So people make a living doing that there. Oh, the church. Oh, okay. So in St. Louis, in the St. Louis area, I had mentioned that there's pockets of these communities around the country that eat muskrat. So in St. Louis, the community there got an exemption from the Catholic Church that the folks who eat muskrat could eat muskrat during Lent because it's an aquatic animal. It's, because according to the Catholic Church, you can only eat fish. I'm sorry, I'm just Catholic, so I made a big leap there. During Lent, it's mainly Good Friday these days, or it is Good Friday these days, where you're supposed to just eat fish, and you're not supposed to eat meat. And because it's an aquatic animal, they got this exemption, which I think is an interesting little tidbit. Anyone else? How many farms? Honestly, I couldn't tell you. I can tell you that the farms that are here now, most of them are, hundreds of acres. They're big farms. They're large farms. They do large-scale production. A lot of the smaller farms, as I had mentioned, have been gobbled up by the bigger farms that are surrounding them, and hopefully that'll change. Anyone else? Well, thank you.